Where were you then when this was a hit?
Andy and the Big Funk. No, not an uncharacteristic story by Roald Dahl, but a funk band that has been blasting its way on stages throughout this disunited kingdom and the rest of the world for several decades now.
Take it down, take it down. I thought that I had your heart. You know you had mine from the north and we made up.
Starting out in that distant epoch, sometimes known as the early 90s, Acid, Give It Up for Manchester, etc., it was the product of that slightly irresolute self-promoter and vocalist, Andy Wood Mitchell.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that my feelings about my own singing is kind of, I don't know how I actually genuinely feel about my voice, but I know that I've been able to perform in front of people and they don't seem to run in the other direction, and so I got the impression that I could probably make a living out of it.
Its inception grew out of the ashes of his previous band that, after 7 years, had given up its attempt to dominate the world of pop music and left him with a gig-sized hole to fill, and he instinctively returned to soul, R&B, and initially, a few other things besides.
When the kind of the covers side of the thing started, which was really back in the days of the AM band, when we were still essentially an originals band and started doing cover version gigs just to make some bread and butter, really, stuff. So we started doing parties and things. It was through Larry Price at Dover Street, in fact, that got me into sort of the murky world of covers. And when the band started, I didn't have this panoply of talented musicians. I wasn't even aware these people are around, or if I did, I mean, like, I remember seeing Jodie, for instance, when I was about 16, and she was playing with Pete Townsend at the Brixton Academy. So these kind of musicians never seemed to be vaguely in the sphere of people I was ever going to work with.
The original lineup was made up of Andy on vocals and screechy harp, Steve Lafie, the former drummer of the AM band, Mickey Englert on bass, Dave Simmons on keys, old guitarist from his earlier band, Mike Caton, and for a brief time, Dave Ortium, also on guitar. Over the years, there were a few changes in the steady lineup, the band gradually increasing in size as it changed the original and indisputably naff name of the Minor Birds to the dull yet self-explanatory AM Band again, and for some while, the possibly silly but some thought, well, let's face it, Andy, mildly amusing name, the Below Average White Band. final lineup from 1997 to 1999 was Andy as usual. Mickey Englert, Steve Murphy on keys, Jim Benham on drums, Rod Blake and Chris Newland sharing the guitar chair, Greg Heath on tenor, and initially Kevin Reynolds on alto sax, which was eventually swapped for the rather more conventional brass pairing of trumpet, with Luke Tunney and Speedy, aka Sandra Stevenson, also on vocals. Later on, living up to its name, the band grew bigger again, adding yet another vocalist quite often, Andrea Groves or Anita Kelsey, Tina Lyle on percussion, and for the first time, Trevor Myers on trombone. From then on, the lineup became a little looser, with Andy continuing to source the top players in London, with many of the band's current contributors appearing around that time.
The lineups gradually got better and better, and the opportunity to work with different musicians. But I would say it's taken something like 25 odd years to find 4 keyboard players or something that I like working with, or 5 drummers.
Yeah, Andy, but sing a little bit, because I need to mark up where I am, Andy, because I ain't got no chord charts like them, man. 1, 2, 3.
When I came back to England in like 1983, I was working with Tony Mason a lot, you know, doing the same thing that we do now, like the rhythm section thing, you know. And I'd met Tony through a friend of mine who's playing with, who'd come up to England with a calypso band. And we were doing lots of that stuff together. And when we did those gigs, Perry was at a lot of those gigs, and he knew Tony as well, and that whole thing. And we kind of connected then. And I think the difference is that we, at the time, we were, Perry was getting into programming. Yeah, that's right, yeah. He was getting into programming, and I was doing a little bit of programming. And we started, I think we did programming things before playing things. Yeah. Yeah, I think we did a lot of those little like you know, I had a little tiny studio set up, and Perry had a drum, you know, we started doing like little, you know, production, writing things together.
No, they're a great bunch of guys. Perry, phenomenal drummer. Wayne News, phenomenal bass player. You know, Matt, phenomenal keyboard player. You know, what can I say? Andy, phenomenal singer. You know, myself trying to catch up with all of them. But still, you know, it's all good.
It must have been about 98, I reckon, or 99. Maybe 98, I think it was.
And you came in via a sub.
That's right, yeah.
But we do have a lot of fun together when we tease Andy mercilessly, which is always fun. And how we get on with the rest of the boys in the band. Yeah, it's a great gathering and a good team of people when we get together. You know, we're all very, very busy and all super busy doing wonderful things and making other artists sound good, you know. But then when we get together, there's not much pressure, and therefore we have a great time, you know, singing in the band.
To me, I mean, those big gigs are nice and they're fun, and you get, you know, and they're an opportunity in some ways, for sure. But it's the other gigs where you actually grow as a musician, to me, the ones, because you know, you might not know the stuff very well. It's on the fly half the time, and you don't get a chance to rehearse. So it's not the same every night. You're playing with all different kinds of bands. And you're lugging your stuff. You're going here. You're going there. It's the blood of this lifestyle, to me. It is. So I mean, you know, who would ever complain about getting a gig in a club? It's a thing that keeps your chops up, and it just keeps you going, and you meet new musicians, and it's, you know, it's essential.
Meanwhile, he was also playing smaller gigs with regular studio collaborator Matthew Johnson, who increasingly began playing with the full band as Steve Murphy's touring commitments made him less available, and Andy took the opportunity to book him whenever he was available to cover gigs with a bigger lineup.
Obviously, Matt was... We worked together for a long, long time before he went off to the heady heights of Jamiroquai and stuff, but he and I worked together both doing these duo gigs where he was sort of doing the one-man band thing and also in the band. And yeah, he was a big, massive influence, both in terms of what we did live, but also in production. I learnt enormous amounts working with him in the studio and stuff, actually. I could say he was maybe, apart from maybe Neil, he would be the single biggest influence. But yeah, it's taken a long time to meet all these musicians. Yeah, he's a brilliant guy, and he's like a lot of really talented people. He doesn't actually tend to blow his own trumpet, but they're all like that. I mean, Wayne and Perry. I think the thing about the players I work with now is that most of them, you know, and that includes all the people in the horn section like Trevor and Simon and Chris and so on, they're all producers and kind of working on their own stuff, but they're also producers in their own right. And that makes a lot of difference when you're on stage, because every single one of them is working to the overall sound. They're not people who generally come along thinking, I've got to prove how brilliant I am by showing how many chops I can play. And that's quite a big, in terms of funk music, that's essential, because it's never really about the one particular musician or singer or anything. It is about the whole thing working as a locked-in unit.
Got me moving, got me moving. 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 Hey!
The live scene in London was buzzing, and in addition to playing at their regular W1 haunt, the eponymous Dover Street, Borb, as it was then, had a number of residencies, including some barn of a place on the embankment that now houses a lot of inebriated clubbers, imagining they're in a Nicholas Roeg movie, The Walkabout, for anyone who wasn't born in the 70s, and the equally eponymous Roof Garden. With these and several impressive events under their belt, including the Variety Club of Great Britain's annual ball, the theatrical premiere of The Lion King, Cowes Festival, Brands Hatch, the America's Cup, the annual Soap Awards and the wedding of Claudia Schiffer, it was decided to ditch the old name for the marginally more serious Big Funk Corporation.
Various people complained, Wayne amongst them, about not wanting to be in the band called the Below Average White Band. So then I had to look around for a new name. And the most nondescript thing I could come up with was the Big Funk Corporation.
Throughout this period, the band's lead singer had been dabbling with a number of different musical forms, including blues, gospel, jazz specials, great, rock, reggae, and other themed musical presentations such as Woodstock Rock, The Music of Bond, and the obligatory Blues Brothers.
I'm a soul man. I'm a soul man.
And a semi-theatrical event known as The Roots of Soul.
Cyril is now ready to actually enter the story in person. And carry on this completely pointless tale of romance, heartbreak, downright lust. And hopefully some music as well. Featuring the Soul Brothers, the Gospel Sister, masquerading as various other characters.
That's me.
Meet them all in the adventures of Cyril, which has often come to be known, especially in promotional literature, as the roots of soul.
The Roots of Soul was originally a sort of weird play thing that I'd written with lots and lots of classic funk and soul records, and basically the idea of it was that at the time when I wrote it, it was that dark period in live performance that was riddled with tribute acts, and I didn't want to do a tribute act, and so what I thought I'd do is write a sort of show, a bit like kind of Forbidden Planet for those people who can remember that far back, or that sort of thing, which was just a collection of great songs with a very thin narrative, and I was the narrator.
And it's nice to know the music just keeps on progressing. The music of today bears no relation to that of yesterday, as I think this evening has demonstrated. Now you can start. Yeah, it is. All right. All right.
Originally, I sang in it, and then I decided when we did the last performance that it didn't make sense for this Wally character called Cyril to sing in it. So, in fact, I cut all my songs apart from the very last tune when he suddenly gets his revelation about soul music, because it's all basically a very hackneyed story about him trying to discover the roots of soul, because he's born in Barnet and is suburban and middle class and doesn't know anything about music.
I was drowned, I was washed up and left for dead. I looked down at my feet and I saw they bled. I looked round and I saw lots of crust of bread. I was crowned with a spike running through my head. But it's
And it kind of got revived again with a thing called The Big Funk City Story, when I was trying to sort of employ the same idea but make it slightly more, with a few more modern tunes, and also slightly more involved in directly connecting the band with the title. But that didn't go anywhere, and then it got a new kind of revamp with Adrian financing the Can You Handle It album.
Can you handle it? 'Cause you ain't had nothing like it when it comes to
Which again produced the soundtrack, but we never in fact ever did the show. So but essentially it was a very similar idea, except that in this case it was a detective trying to discover I can't remember the silly idea I had, but there was something about it. The character was sort of based on Mr. Funk or something that naff, and he's on the heels of this character trying to discover all about funk and soul music. So it's a story that's sort of been revived a couple of times, but in fact the only time we ever did it where we actually staged it was with the Roots of Soul. But we did do it a few times. It was always done for charity, and we had people like Angie Brown doing it, and Catherine Ellis did it once actually, and so we had a few. I had some great vocals, and Speedy and Shaz and so on, Anita Kelsey, can't remember who else, John, I think, was involved in it as well. But anyway, that was sort of the premise of it. There you go.
Should break my heart in two if you should run into my arms and tremble like a flower. Woo. Yeah. Get the drum and the kickers in there. Hey.
The most recent departure from the funk and R&B sound was a celebration of the music of Mr. David Jones, possibly better known as The Bow. No, he's never been known as that actually. David Bowie in 2016 at the Fabulous Cargo in Shoreditch.
It does seem like there's a few more people have popped off in the last few years than is natural, but I wonder whether that's partly because there was an era that is celebrated more. So the sort of the 70s and that period was a particularly high point because of its impact culturally. And I'm afraid from the 80s onwards, the impact culturally, I think, of music artists has kind of gradually diminished, partly because of the commercialism, and doesn't necessarily mean that the pop music industry is bad, but it definitely has become less about the individual ideas and personalities of people and more about some ideal of what you can create.
In 2010, lead singer Andy Mitchell missed a valuable opportunity that would have changed his direction completely and possibly led to the demise of the Big Funk. But maybe there's an alternative universe where this has actually happened. Or possibly closer to home.
I nearly sort of spun off in another direction when I got an audition to possibly replace, well, the singer from the Yardbirds was leaving, this lovely guy called John Dryden, and he very sweetly, he was very nice in that he put me forward. He remembered me from the blues days a million years ago when I'd been on the blues circuit, and he put my name forward to Jim McCarthy, who also knew me a bit. And initially it looked like it was quite likely it was going to happen, and as the audition got closer and closer, it seemed less and less likely. And then when I turned up to do the audition, and I learned sort of 12 or 15 songs or something, and we did a few of those. And another guy turned up to do the audition, and later on, I bumped into this guy, and he was a very nice guy, and I met him at some jam, and we were chatting, and he ended up getting the job of the Yardbirds lead vocalist. But the funny thing about it was that being the total narcissist I am, every now and then I Google my name and I Google the band and stuff just to see if there's any adverse publicity or any publicity at all. And up came Andrew Mitchell, lead singer of the Yardbirds. And I thought, well, hang on a minute, that's very strange. I was never the lead singer of the Yardbirds. And I then checked it out, and it was this guy. And I'd heard that there was another Andy Mitchell because he'd had a record deal years and years ago, and somebody rang me up to congratulate me about getting a record deal that I didn't get. And he was also the guy that ended up getting the Yardbirds. And he ended up being the lead singer of the Yardbirds. So that's how there's a kind of a parallel universe, and there's a much more talented, much nicer Andy Mitchell who went on to be the lead singer of the Yardbirds, but had the same name as me. But it's really ironic that we both turned up I think, in fact, he was the only other person to audition it for the Yardbirds. So I wonder whether they actually thought it was him they were auditioning and got stuck with me as well because they didn't know who I was, and then they got landed with 2 Andy Mitchells. I'm not really sure, but that was I found that quite amusing, actually. That would have changed the direction. I probably wouldn't have been, doing the band that much if that had happened, because I would have been involved with that.
Always interested in expanding the visual effect of the band, he has brought in the fabulous expertise of Della Bahuju and Danielle Duncan Rosenbert, and he threatens to galump in an unlikely manner alongside them, doing his Max Wall of Funk impersonation. Wow, that's what he calls it.
My introducing nutty dancing to soul music.
That's right. Well, not nutty.
Yeah, I've been. You have a choice between standing still or trying to move, and so yeah, I've been trying to. I have sort of introduced possibly more movement into the performances. Obviously we had the dancers for quite a few years with the wonderful Della and Danielle, of course, and so on. But yeah, I've rather against my own better judgment, I've got more involved in trying to bring some more of that into the band. But as I say, with this rather strange kind of movements that I introduce, but it's better than. I think probably better than me just standing still. So that's that's kind of why. After all, it ain't Chris Brown, that's for sure. But on the other hand, it's I think probably better to do something rather than do nothing.
11 for the 11 riders, 12 for the 12 apostles. He was born. To call, heaven help us all. Heaven help us all.
As mentioned, Mitchell has always had a strong commitment to record original material, utilising the considerable array of talent he's encountered running the band. But in 2010, the Big Funk finally recorded under its own name, sort of, a single for the charity the African Book Foundation. Later, they produced not one, but 2 albums, Can You Handle It and He Ain't Heavy.
He ain't heavy, he's my brother. So on we go. His welfare's of my concern.
Financed by the Anarchic Events Coordinator and entrepreneur Adrian Silas.
It's that thing with cover versions that if you are going too much down the road of replicating what's gone before, it becomes a little bit redundant as a process, because what are you giving to it unless you can genuinely think that you're doing a better performance. and the more musicians you get with that, it's more necessary to have people with restricted egos that are working for the overall, not for some, moment of glory, as it were. But they're all people that I feel very privileged that I get them on the gigs when I do.
So what's the curmudgeon of soul's ideal instrument lineup in a perfect world, with everyone available and no budget restrictions at all?
I think actually what we did with Priscilla, which was a function we did a few years ago, we had a 16-piece string section and 6 horns, 5 backgrounds, percussion, only Matt on keyboards, but we didn't need that was fine. Drums and bass and guitar, obviously. That would be ideal. I mean, that was a big sound. It sounded amazing.
And a big sound is about, it's arranged.
Yeah, the thing is, when you do covers, for instance, and you do things like Car Wash, you're quite often, bloody bird, you're quite often beating those songs into submission. But when we had the opportunity to have a string section and the horns and all the rest of it, it sounded as big as the record. It's very enjoyable to actually have that sound. I don't think I'd want a larger lineup than that. I know I'm not looking for the LSO to come along and play with us necessarily.
Your wish. Come on now. I said fire. What I said, baby. Fire. Got me burning, got me burning. Ooh.
He's a very, very naughty man. I mean, I'm on his website right now, but he is a very naughty man.